Where did the FBI go awry? It is a bit of a trick question because there is an answer, and the answer, as is often the case, is in the Constitution. There is no place for a federal police force in the United States Constitution. Our founders probably understood that the direction that it would take if we did do so. It's also why there's no standing army. Let's just look at some recent examples before we go back and look at the history of the FBI and ways in which it has always been problematized by its politicized character. Though the nature of it has expanded and extended and has gone to a scale and a scope we have never witnessed before, beginning with the election or just the campaign of President Trump. Take, for example, the January 6th Proud Boys trial taking place currently in the District of Columbia. In that case, there has been multiple documentation of the role of informants, infiltrators, and instigators in the events of January 6th. I was there on January 6th. I decided not to take the unauthorized tour of the Capitol. I was instead sitting in the offices of some Trump cabinet officials as we ultimately watched it unfold. I was there at the behest of President Trump after representing him in Georgia and challenging what was taking place in the election. I would note that President Trump only filed one election contest himself that he was able to legally, and that took place in Georgia. Of note, the court somehow, even though the court was required to conduct a hearing within 5 days of its filing, on January 6th, the Georgia courts had still just not got around, weeks after its filing, to ever hearing the case. Indeed, they wouldn't decide to hear it until after January 6th came and went. In fact, there was never an evidentiary hearing on the election contest President Trump filed in Georgia. It was amidst that frustration and agitation that people gathered that day on January 6th to hear the president speak, and as the president asked them to do, to peacefully protest outside the Capitol to make sure that our Constitution's framework for adjudicating election disputes and controversies, which, by the way, despite what Vice President Mike Pence would have some people believe, both Vice President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson had exercised their constitutional authority to decide electoral contests going back to the very founding of our country. And then people got wind as they were outside the Capitol that that was not going to occur. Pence made the peculiar decision to wait to release his decision until right at the beginning of that presentation, which helped put certain things into motion. But things were already in motion. There was an unusual lack of law enforcement present that day. The Capitol is the most secure building in the world, particularly on January 6th. There are over 2,500 people that are just police officers of the Capitol. Once again, we may be seeing part of our problem. Why does the Capitol even have a police? If they had had regular local police, there's the issue of District of Columbia having its own control, and that being a separate and secondary question. But if it had had regular police not under political control, maybe they would have been properly present that day and there never would have been any issues. Because what happened was there was an unusual lack of security in some parts of the Capitol, number one. Number two, there were other members of the police that were actually guiding protesters into a compressed area where they would then be attacked by members of the Capitol Police, that would lead to people reacting and responding, and only the people that reacted and responded were caught on camera, broadcast to the world, or ultimately prosecuted. The Capitol Police, who initiated and instigated that conflict, took a complete walk from any accountability and responsibility. Then you had other Capitol Police that were escorting people into the building that day, while other Capitol Police were attacking them in other parts of the building. So, if you had just stumbled into it, you didn't know what was happening. It was still one of the most unusual Capitol riots in American history, and there have been plenty of Capitol riots through our history, through the history around the world. You can watch the protests currently taking place in France to see what real riots look like. They usually involve, either farmers dumping food or manure, depending on their choice that day, on the public streets, or people raiding into buildings or protesting BLM style, as took place in the summer of 2020, just a few months before those protests. While the people that did those BLM protests, including threatening to burn down St. John's, the great historic church across from the White House, not only did they not get criminally prosecuted, many of them actually got checks written from the federal government for the wrongful harassment they suffered for simply policing that building that day. Meanwhile, people who took that unauthorized tour of the Capitol and had to be some of the most peaceful rioters in the history of rioting. These are people that literally stayed between the lines half the time as they're walking through the Capitol. These are people who didn't steal any art. The only thing that got taken was a now famously memed event, someone who took the little pedestal on Pelosi's with him. There was a gentleman who put his feet up on Pelosi's desk. What's undisclosed is what came out at his trial. It was the media asking him to put his feet on Pelosi's desk. These are people who just came in, often directed to do there. There were people around, people like Mr. Epps. Apparently Rupert Murdoch doesn't want people talking about Mr. Epps because Tucker Carlson, the most popular TV news host in the modern age, had to resign yesterday or was separated from his employment for talking about what? According to the LA Times and the New York Times, for talking about Ray Epps. This was the very unusual case of the man who got a 60 Minutes profile while bragging in text to his kid about how he helped organize January 6th into an event that could lead to people being criminally prosecuted and punished, while he himself has never been criminally prosecuted and punished. He's not the only one. They have found in the Proud Boys trial, a friend of mine, colleague, Norm Pattis, is one of the defense lawyers, by the way, an old school Robert Kennedy-style Democratic liberal who's defending some of the Proud Boys, including Joe Biggs, in that trial, has found more evidence of government misconduct and malfeasance and misfeasance than in any case he's ever been a part of, and he's had the privilege of being a part of, unfortunately, too many in our legal system, going on decades of representation. You can recognize Norm as an old civil rights lefty because he still has a ponytail like that's still popular as if it was the 1960s. In that case, what they found is they're now approaching over 100 informants, infiltrators, and instigators that day. People that were on the government payroll who were the ones directing people to go into the building, directing the people to confront the Capitol Police, directing people to try to take things once they were inside the building, directing people to be confrontational. And that is just one aspect of the degree to which January 6th was very much a Fedsurrection, not an insurrection. In other aspects, you can go into the QAnon movement and oddities about that movement in terms of who and what Q actually was. I remember a few months before the election saying that I had deep suspicions of the QAnon movement because it read and felt like an attempt to incorporate artificial intelligence into the ultimate informant, infiltrator, instigator kind of event. That for years, law enforcement has struggled to infiltrate various political groups to try to cause them to do counterproductive things. This is what, in fact, COINTELPRO was all about. That will take us back to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's program to infiltrate various civil rights organizations, anti-war organizations, other organizations associated with mostly the political left, but not always. They also went at the John Birch Society. They also went at various organizations on the right that were known for questioning and being skeptical of institutional narratives as to matters of war and other civil rights and civil liberties issues. That the goal was to be able to infiltrate them without requiring an individual do so. Is it really a coincidence that what we saw in Michigan involving the attempts to rescue Governor Whitmer's political career successfully ultimately by staging a fake kidnapping that was basically just some nerds hanging out in their basements that had no idea about anything, didn't know how to do anything, and it turns out that 2/3 of the people involved were all federal agents, that they were the ones who originated the idea, they were the ones who came up with it. When they got an honest trial, many of them were acquitted. The judge made sure they didn't get an honest trial the second time around. While some of the FBI agents involved in that case were ultimately found involved in getting into fights over swinger parties, to give you an idea for the moral values of that Federal Bureau of Investigation office, the person who helped run the fake kidnapping, fake insurrection Michigan effort had previously been tried to get the Michigan militia-aligned groups to stage such an event at the Michigan State Capitol during the COVID protest and the lockdown protest. Where do you think that person ended up a few weeks before January 6th? Ended up in Washington, D.C., and ended up being one of the lead FBI agents in charge of the January 6th cases. Is that a complete coincidence that the person who helped organize and orchestrate the Whitmer entrapment plot ends up being integral to the January 6th activities? The U.S. prosecutors and the media and federal judges, sadly, have all been complicit at trying to suppress this information, and despite their efforts, the Proud Boy defense lawyers have documented more and more and more of all the people on the federal payroll. And that doesn't even get to QAnon, which was trying to convince people leading up to January 6th that there were white hats in the FBI and in the Justice Department and in the intelligence operations and in the military that wanted them to take drastic action that day, that they were actually agents of the government if they went in and took dramatic action that day. Was that not also itself potentially part of a broader attempt by people within the FBI at the 7th floor level to get people to take counterproductive action to discredit them and discredit the election challenge? I remember being there the day before, talking to Trump's lawyers, meeting with members of Congress, and I was curious. I was like, the National Guard was all over the place, by the way, but then would, at the request of the D.C. mayor and Speaker of the House Pelosi, disappear despite Trump's request on the day of January 6th. So the National Guard was not present, even though Trump had asked them to be there. Had they had the regular Capitol Police presence or the regular Guard presence that had been requested by the president, January 6th never happens, despite all the infiltrators, instigators, and informants' presence and attempts to provoke. Ray Epps is there the day before trying to provoke people, and people are spotting him for the provocateur that he is. But I was curious, how did Mitch McConnell, how did Nancy Pelosi have such confidence that there was going to be no meaningful vote, no meaningful debate on the electoral contest challenge, given the constitutional history that supported it? Senator Cruz, Senator Paul, and others were getting together in an effort to create an 1876 style commission to look at what happened in Georgia, what happened in Arizona, what happened in Nevada, what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in Michigan, what happened in Pennsylvania, which was, as the Wisconsin Supreme Court would later confirm, a lot of illegal ballots were included in the presidential count that should not have been. And there were people who voted who weren't constitutionally qualified to vote. There were people whose votes were cast in a manner that wasn't constitutionally qualified, and the vote was counted and canvassed in a way that wasn't constitutionally qualified, because the Constitution requires that the rules be established by the legislature of the state, not by secret court orders, not by behind-the-scenes executive officials, not by Mark Elias cutting a deal with some corrupt person, not Zuckerberg buying off a local election office, none of that. All of those were legitimate issues, and yet they were incredibly confident that somehow they were never going to really see the light of day, that they were going to be demonized in some way. And Matt, is it really a coincidence that then January 6th develops the way that it does? Now that we know about the informants and infiltrators and instigators, why did the FBI and the Justice Department suddenly lose all interest in who and what QAnon really was, what Q really was? There was an obsession about it leading up to the election, and all of a sudden a complete lack of interest, as if they didn't want the world to dig deeper and to see what might be behind that.